levels were locked in some kind of chemical embrace. The extent of that link became clear at the end of our session, when the therapist handed me a printout of my adrenaline levels plotted over our 30-minute encounter. It was, simply put, a timeline of my attempts at humor, a flat line interrupted by 5 or 6 dramatic spikes. I looked at that paper and thought, I've caught a glimpse of me here, viewed from an angle that I've never experienced before. I'd known for many years that I had a tendency to crack jokes compulsively in certain social situations, particularly in situations where the formality of the setting made humor a riskier bet. But I'd never thought about those jokes as triggering a chemical reaction in my own head. Suddenly, they seemed less like casual attempts at humor, and more like a drug addict's hungering for a new fix. I knew those adrenaline surges were just the tip of the iceberg. The creation and appreciation of humor is a remarkably complex neurological event, involving many parts of the brain and a host of chemical messengers. Doctors at the University of California Medical School, for example, recently located a small region near the front of the left brain that appears to trigger the feeling of mirth. While treating a 16-year-old epileptic patient, they applied a tiny jolt of electric current to the area, which caused the patient to find humor in whatever she happened to be looking at. This wasn't merely a physical reflex of laughter. Things genuinely seemed funny to her when the region was stimulated. "You guys are just so funny, standing around," she told her startled doctors. Laughter itself involves a complex array of muscle actions, and there is increasing evidence that it triggers the release of small amounts of endorphins, the brain's natural painkillers. The next time you visit a comedy club, think opium den. But making jokes in conversation also requires a subtle sense of one's audience, a feel for their sense of humor and state of mind. Such outer-directed imagination is itself governed by another part of the brain, a part believed to be damaged in autistics, and that accounts for their strained social interactions. This is what came to my mind as I thought about my nervous jokes on the biofeedback practitioner's couch. That with each of those jokes somewhere in my head, there was an elaborate electrochemical ballet unfolding, one that had been evolving since my first smile, or before. And now I had glimpsed a subsection of that inner performance as it happened. I found myself wondering how many of these little chemical subroutines are running in my brain on any given day, at any given moment. And what would it tell me about myself if I could see them, the way I could see those adrenaline spikes on the printout? And so, biofeedback started me on my quest. I set out to track down as many charts, real-time displays, and 3D models of my mental life as I could. I talked to some of the world's leading neuroscientists, asking them the question I'd been asking myself. How had understanding the brain changed the way they thought about themselves? I also found technology startups and armchair enthusiasts who had embraced brain science as a tool for self-exploration. It was a propitious time to make this journey. Over the past 3 decades, science has given us extraordinary glimpses of the brain's inner geography, illuminating the amazing extent to which different tasks activate clearly defined regions. Recognizing the face of a loved one, or planning a grocery list, or stringing together a sentence. Thus far, these new scientific tools have been employed mostly to observe people who have suffered neurological damage, and to assess the mental maps shared by all human brains. But brains are like fingerprints. Each of us possesses a unique neurological topography. We now have the technology in place to picture that inner landscape in itself as it really is. These are tools, in other words, for exploring our individual minds with all their quirkiness and inimitability. These are tools for capturing who we are on the level of synapses and neurotransmitters and brainwaves. Every human brain is capable of generating different patterns of electrical and chemical activity. The promise of these new tools involves being able to figure out what your pattern looks like, and then figuring out what that pattern tells you about yourself. It's likely that you've thought about the patterns of your own brain's wiring before. The general movement of popular psychology over the past century has been one from deeply figurative descriptions of mental traits toward greater physiological specificity. The movement, in a sense, from Oedipus to the neuron. Adrenaline itself has entered our everyday lexicon, as has the notion of our body administering quick chemical fixes purely for pleasure. We do things, we say, for the adrenaline rush or the endorphin high. Radio ads now tout various wonder drugs' ability to alter our neurotransmitter profiles, as though they were selling dandruff shampoo. If you've read Listening to Prozac, you've probably met a person who seemed depressed and thought, very low serotonin. But such responses are just hunches about our inner physiological states, and crude ones at that. There are dozens of so-called information molecules in your body, neurotransmitters, hormones, peptides, each playing a key role in your shifting emotional response to external events, triggering everything from the nurturing instinct in mothers to the agitated surge of a panic attack. Could tools that measure the minute-by-minute levels of those substances in your body and brain teach you something about your own emotional toolbox? Could they help you make sense of your dreams or your phobias? We've learned to track our mood changes with a statistician's exactitude, to explore our childhood memories, to keep our minds alert with exercise. But your moods and memories and perceptions are themselves derived from electrochemical activity in your brain. What could you learn about yourself if you could catch a glimpse of that activity directly? If you could see what your brain looked like when it was remembering a long-forgotten childhood experience, or listening to a favorite song, or conceiving a good idea. Brain imaging tools are miracles of modern science, but they are not the only channels to your mind's inner life. Simply possessing a more informed understanding of your brain's internal architecture can change the way you think about yourself. Part of such a process involves separating out mental routines that you typically experience in unison. If you know nothing about what's actually happening in your head, the neurological activity you experience is invisible. It's just you being yourself. But the more you learn about the brain's architecture, the more you recognize that what happens in your head is more like an orchestra than a soloist, with dozens of players contributing to the overall mix. You can hear the symphony as a unified wash of sound, but you can also distinguish the trombones from the timpani, the violins from the cellos. To come to a comparable understanding of your own head, you don't need $1 million imaging machine. You just need to learn something about the brain's components and their typical patterns of activation. Sometimes those components come in the form of specialized brain regions. Sometimes they come in the form of chemicals like serotonin. Invariably, a certain mood that strikes you will contain a mix of both, the result of both neurochemical release and predictable activity in specific regions of your brain. As you learn to detect these brain components, you start to recognize how much multitasking is really going on in your own head. You realize that the emotion you feel isn't simply a reaction to the world at that moment, but rather something closer to a drug with a strange life of its own. There's what we used to call a rational you and an emotional you, and the two aren't always in sync. Brain science has now given us more accurate descriptions of these two sides of a personality, mapped onto specific regions of the brain. Instead of rational and emotional, Today, we have the neocortical you